From the 1890s to the roaring 1920s was a powerful time of growing change resulting from the boom of industry following the Civil War. Known as the Progressive Era, this period also inspired many social reforms. Socialism came into light and expose literature captured the public's attention. These writers were known as muckrakers, a term originally used negatively by President Theodore Roosevelt when he referenced a passage from the Pilgrim's Progress, with the quote, "The man with the muckrake, who could look no way but downward." Roosevelt implied these writers focused on filth rather than true journalism, but the term later became a word associated with activism and the courage to expose social wrongdoing. Many changes resulted from the muckrakers' efforts, especially in government and industry, but arguably the most important barrier broken in the Progressive Era were the changes in the meatpacking industry. The meatpacking industry in the Chicago stockyards was a terrible mess of unsanitary practices and public trickery. The greedy company owners demanded near impossible high-risk work for only pennies an hour and no workers' compensation. One specific writer, Upton Sinclair, in his novel The Jungle, set off the major spark in the flame of reform. One guidebook once noted not to see the yards is to miss seeing Chicago, and with the constant noise and smell of millions of swine and cattle, plus the low-hanging smoke from half a dozen chimneys, it was really hard to miss this disgusting mess of industry. In the 1900s, 4 primary slaughterhouse companies in the U.S. settled in Chicago to form the sprawling Union stockyards. The Armour, Morris, National, and Swift packing companies received their first cows and 15 rickety cattle cars on Christmas Day, the year 1865. Inside the building, there were commonly male immigrant workers doing almost 80 different jobs, inaccurately called disassembly lines. Jobs included knockers, rippers, leg breakers, and gutters, and women and children over 14 worked at meat trimming, sausage making, and canning. The sanitation around and of the workers was atrocious. Employees that worked with knives in the assembly lines frequently lost fingers, and workers near lard vats sometimes fell in, leaving their bones and flesh to be mixed in with the lard. The men who carried the dead animals on their backs would sometimes end up crippled or with serious back problems. And some workers had diseases like tuberculosis and would sometimes cough up and spit blood on the floor near the meat, and many had different skin diseases. With no bathrooms around, the laborers would urinate in the corners and had no way to wash their hands. The meat was sometimes placed on the ground on top of layers of sawdust and rat droppings. Since these lower-class workers made only pennies per hour, they were unable to afford decent housing and transportation. They crowded in tenement apartments and dealt with the smell of the stockyards and nearby dumps. Historian James Barrett writes, "One became aware of Packingtown long before stepping down from the streetcar near the great stone gate of the Union stockyards. The unique yard smell, a mixture of decaying blood, hair, and organic tissue, fertilizer dust, smoke, and other ingredients, permeated the air of the surrounding neighborhoods. Sociologist Charles J. Bushnell could not capture the smells, perhaps, but his photographs offer visual evidence of the area's streets and its crowded apartments. Robert Hunter documented conditions in tenements in other parts of the city in order to advocate for housing reform. His report focused on other neighborhoods because he considered back-of-the-yards housing so bad that he could not fairly represent conditions throughout the city. But workers' conditions weren't the only problem that would engross the nation. Journalists observed how meatpacking companies were tricking the American public. Their published charges include packing byproducts in attractive colors. Millions of dollars are made by selling these byproducts. It is charged that much of them are far from being what the labels say they are. And workers in the oleomargarine department, it is charged that much of it is from decayed fat and is sold as genuine dairy butter." Upton Sinclair was born in 1878 in Baltimore to a poor family due to the Civil War wiping out his family's wealth. In retrospect, he seemed destined to write his most famous novel about the meat industry. At age 5, he wrote his first story describing a pig that ate a pin which ended up in his family's sausage. At age 10, Sinclair and his family moved to New York City, where he eventually attended Columbia University. He also started writing adventure stories and selling them to local magazines. The contempt he had developed as a child for the upper classes, along with his struggling writing career, led him to embrace socialism. He joined the Socialist Party in 1903 and eventually wrote for a socialist magazine, Appeal to Reason. The editor of the magazine suggested Sinclair go to Chicago to investigate recent worker strikes in the stockyards for better pay and conditions. The companies brought in new workers to keep the assembly lines running, while the strikers and their families fell into poverty. In the stockyards, Sinclair interviewed workers and their families for 7 weeks. At the young age of 26, he observed firsthand the gruesome scenes of the meatpacking industry. Shaken by what he had seen and heard, Upton wrote a fictional story for the magazine. Beginning as small installments for Appeal to Reason, it soon became a standalone book called The Jungle. The title reflects the similarities between the slaughterhouses and the brutal and savage practices of the natural jungle. The plot centers on the life of a recently married Lithuanian immigrant named Jurgis, hoping for a better life in America for his new bride and family. Jurgis gets a job as a shoveler of guts at the fictional company named Durham, resembling Armour & Co., the leading packer at the time. While working there, Jurgis witnesses all the grisly events taking place within the walls, and eventually is injured. As a result, he loses time at work, which leads to poverty and alcoholism. His life spirals downward until poor and alone on the streets. He stumbles upon the Socialist Party and eventually becomes a major activist for the working class. The story ends on a positive note with Jurgis working for a socialist hotel and his life stabilizing. After being published, sales rocketed. It was an international bestseller, published in 17 different languages, and made into a silent movie in 1914. The book also became a target in some countries. It was banned from public libraries in Yugoslavia, South Korea, and East Germany and burned in the Nazi fires because of Sinclair's socialist views. When Americans read the novel, they were appalled, not by the workers' treatment, but with the quality of the meat being foisted upon the public. A famous quote from Sinclair himself being, "With the jungle, I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach." People bombarded the White House demanding change, and after President Theodore Roosevelt himself read the novel, he directed the U.S. Department of Agriculture to investigate Sinclair's claims. The USDA reported back that the jungle was mostly lies and exaggerations. However, President Roosevelt was skeptical because he knew about the department's close ties to the meatpacking industry. He secretly sent Labor Commissioner Charles P. Neal and social workers James B. Reynolds to double-check the statement, and they verified that the terrible conditions described in the jungle were real. The president took immediate action. Many acts barely discussed before were now being put in effect. Bills designed to regulate the food industry had been languishing in Congress for decades until the jungle came out and thrust them into the national spotlight. The Food and Drug Administration, FDA, was created as a direct reaction to the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act on July 30th, 1906. This was the same year The Jungle was published. The FDA requires restaurant workers and cooks to complete a food handling course that teaches them the main causes of foodborne illnesses and how to prevent them. Although the FDA could never completely ensure the safety of all food, this organization has significantly bettered our sanitation and quality of meat. Fresh meat is something we take for granted today, and if it wasn't for the work of Sinclair and his fellow muckrakers in the Progressive era, we would not have the same trust in our food supply that we have today. Upton Sinclair with The Jungle truly broke barriers in the history of food processing and industry.